Hello and welcome to this video on the Mentats of Dune and how it can be possible. Mentats are a specialized individual within Frank Herbert's Dune universe. They are effectively human computers, but also more. They are absolute machines of logic and reasoning, or at least that's what they're meant to be, but they are also human, which creates a certain conflict between the humanity of the Mentat and the pure logic. This makes the Mentat an interesting juncture of science, technology, biology, philosophy, and even to a degree, psychology. Let's start with why Mentats exist. The first reason is simply the Butlerian Jihad, an event wherein humanity rose up against AI, which to no one's surprise was seeking to destroy humanity. Following this, AI was banned as per the Orange Catholic Bible. Effectively, do not create any machine that can do what a human can. This led to the three major alternatives to computers: the Spacing Guild and Navigators, the Bene Gesserit and Sisters, and finally the Mentat. Each has the same or similar sort of role as a computer in ways, but with different applications. Navigators are a space version of GPS, Bene Gesserit a human analysis, Mentats are calculators and modelling software, language, and more. This means Mentats are the multi-tool of Dune, but as a result, they are not able to do the same things as the others, such as predicting safe passage like a guild navigator, or influence people like a Twitch thought or OnlyFans account. Wait, we mean a Bene Gesserit. The Mentats are like the guild of the Bene Gesserit. They are a formal organization called the Order of Mentats. Mentats are supposed to be able to handle vast memories and ability to organize huge amounts of data. They often provided valuable insight that would otherwise not be available or lost entirely. To get this ability, the Mentat underwent training and conditioning almost since birth. It's described as the naive mind, or a superlogical mind without any kind of pre-established ideas, preconceptions, prejudices, or anything else, and it allowed them to almost entirely be logical and concise and apply pure reasoning. This, of course, did result in a degree of uncertainty, mostly because, well, humans aren't necessarily a perfect template of each other. This also did mean that there was a varying degree of certainty, and the conclusions reached could be somewhat variable. The other thing they could do was hypothesize, strategize, and tactically guide through the abilities, especially true of highly skilled Mentats. Although some are said to have had innate Mentat abilities, others were less so. For example, on the extreme end, you have the Fahawat, who was considered something of a unique entity, a idolized example. And this is because each of them is a unique entity. Every individual will vary because they are individuals. But it also means that to make them, you need a very specialized subset of the population. And not just that, in order to get the final, let's say, product in the form of a Mentat, they had to operate within a very strict ethical framework, which, for some purposes, was not exactly desirable. Think of the idea of a drone strike and its idealistic image and the reality of what happens in the Middle East. Further, we have the use of Sappho juice, or the juice of Sappho, which was meant to amplify this ability. The downside to that, of course, is that Sappho juice is very addictive, but when you use it, it doubles or even triples the Mentat's ability to process information. Repeatedly using it will eventually dye the user's lip a reddish color. And then we have, the Bene Tlaxu, the effectively Amazon of the Dune universe, who were known to, let's say, create a variation on the Mentat. These were called twisted Mentats, individuals who had all the strengths of a regular Mentat, that is, logic, hypotheses, strategizing, tactical guidance, politics, and more, without any ethical restraint or limitation. They basically were Amazon. So now we know what a Mentat is, and to some extent where they come from, and we can look into how and why they might exist. And this is both easier and harder, or at least easier and harder based on reality. First, let's begin with what might make someone inclined to becoming a Mentat. The obvious answer is to test them by asking if they use Arch Linux. Well, no, but sort of. As mean as it might be, the answer is simply individual genetics, and particularly genetic conditions, or at least related to genetics such as autism. This is down to the way it plays out in their brain and behavior. In fact, this might be even more relevant as it would explain the variability in Mentat performance. Again, being somewhat direct, but admittedly equally harsh, The various genetic mutations seen in autism, and particularly in changes in organoids, could at least play out to some extent in explaining the variability in mentats, because the more pronounced the autistic traits are in a mentat, the more likely they are to be a better mentat. On the other hand, the less pronounced the phenotypes are, the less effective a mentat they would be. Now, autism is the most immediate and obvious possibility, but it is arguably not the only possibility, but let's stick with keeping this simple for now. And the reason we say autism is a good candidate is because of the changes in brain structure and the consequential changes in behavior. This is useful as a possibility since it's a process that becomes most notable and effective, at least on development, during the early years of life, where children will be most receptive to the conditioning that mentats require. Autism-specific brain imaging has identified features that are relevant and arguably exploitable in developing a mentat as early as 6 months of age, and importantly, the changes are age-specific to the brain. This also leads to behavior changes that can be identified and diagnosed across the first 2 years of life, highlighting that autism spectrum disorders are developmental in nature, or at least have a developmental effect, and can be picked up on early in life, meaning mentats can be selected from a young age. This is further supported, let's say, by neuroimaging studies which not just looked at the behavioral changes, but the changes in the brain structure. For example, the cerebral cortex, cortical shape, the patterns of the sulci and sulcul, the abnormalities in it, and more. Then you have things like where axons join together, how dense those joints are, how complex the connections they form become, the gyrification of it, and there's more again. But then you get into the grey matter itself and look at how the grey matter changes. Now, white matter is high-speed processing and communication. Grey matter means more bodies of the axon. Now, these tend to be more a case of interconnecting signals rather than transmitting signals. In autistic children, you see that the frontal lobe, that is the part of the brain that's responsible for a lot of the logical processing, tends to be enlarged, especially in children and adolescents with autism. This leads to a significant increase in the ability to think critically, logically, and reason. But you also find that the region of the brain that's in the posterior part tends to be, increased in certain ways but decreased in others. This does then have an effect on the, let's be blunt about it, the sociality and the ability to handle emotions and other similar features that come outside of logic. Further to that, we have, as mentioned, things like hyperconnectivity. That is, the increase in the connections of things like the frontotemporal, motor, visual, and memory parts of the brain in children with autism tend to be more pronounced. But you also have disturbances in the thalamo-frontal connections. This leads to issues around emotion. If you look at these studies and then you look at the functional magnetic resonance imaging, you see that there is let's be polite about this. There is better processing, but depending on what it is, not so much better processing with emotional behaviors. However, working memory, executive function, and more tend to be more extremely connected, often described as hyperconnectivity. Then you have visuomotor processing, selective attention, and more. All of these are traits that would be incredibly desirable and would obviously benefit a mentat. And next we have the conditioning that mentats undergo. In a way, this could be said to be forced OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder. Considering the nature and severity of, this, it's not that surprising to find that autistic individuals would, again, to be rather harsh about this, take to it much better than other individuals would. Now, the behavior and particularly the brain changes observed in these individuals seem to be at least somewhat unstable, and over time they will change. And particularly the underlying neurology tends to be different depending on the age and developmental stage of the autistic individuals. Once you get them established, though, they become rather different, and this would support the structure and effects of a rigorous and clear ethical framework. More so if the children who are conditioned this way are not likely to shift or change away from that clear philosophy. Of course, this is not all. To ensure compliance with the framework that we've just described and the fact that there's already a certain amount of propensity towards it, we should describe that the Mentat Guild must condition the trainee Mentats, and in a way it's similar to how religion or cults condition children. Given the Orange Catholic Bible's prevalence and the importance of it in the Dune universe, it wouldn't be unfair to say that religion is a fairly major factor. Basically, fear the great and terrible Tim or AI, whichever you prefer, and whichever seems most appropriate. And therefore, starting from an early childhood or age, instill fear about what will happen if you don't follow the rules. The great and all-powerful Oz will come down from high above and spank you. In this case, the great and powerful Oz is artificial intelligence and various other demonic entities, such as, for instance, operating outside of the ethical framework. Don't do this, you must do that, and so on. And if you break these rules, it will lead to the destruction of humanity, which is the spanking. By ensuring that children learn this early in life, they develop a compulsion to adhere to it, just like in our reality. But in our reality, rather than going to hell already exists. It's just called being on Harkonnen or Gedi Prime, or, in some instances, being on Dune. And next, we have the essential skills for a Mentat. The obvious skills are going to include memory, math, logic, language, critical thinking, and pattern recognition. These are skills and abilities that we have to some degree already described in the way the brain of autistic individuals are already primed. However, just being able to do this in theory does not mean they can. The same children will need to be taught and learn a lot. This is supported by the highest rate of STEM participation being amongst autistic individuals, or at least according to one study. This means they are already good candidates for all the necessary knowledge and skills of a Mentat. And memory is one that is somewhat more difficult to develop though, not just because it's variable, but there are at least two major pathways it could be taken, or approaches that would make it better. Either find a way to trigger an eidetic memory trait, or train them in memory techniques, such as the Memory Palace Hotel or something similar to mnemonic technique. Let's start with eidetic or photographic memory, as this might be what you first imagine. The, let's say, challenge here is that eidetic memory is a trait almost exclusively possessed by children. However, it does wane with age and language ability. On that basis, we can probably dismiss it as a possible early childhood selection criteria, but not the long-term development of Mentat abilities and skills. This leaves option 2, mnemonic devices and other memory techniques. A mnemonic technique is something that uses various ways of encoding various memories, allowing for more easy retrieval of those memories and associating imagery or various things to ensure that what you have in your mind stays there and is more easily accessed, and certainly more efficiently accessed. Now, it's important to note here that it does benefit original information. That is something new you're learning. But it also means that you can hold on to that new information better. It doesn't necessarily contribute to the ability to process that information. That doesn't mean it wouldn't feed into the other skills and abilities that Mentats possess. And that's an important thing here. Having the information available doesn't necessarily mean that you can use the information available. You need to have the processing power. Think of it as being kind of like a computer, to use the fairly generic example. You can have as much RAM and hard drive space as you can possibly need or ever want, but if your CPU can't keep up, it doesn't make a difference. You are still limited. This is where improving other parts of the individual could theoretically help. For example, math. If you were to teach them the rote principles and formulas within math, that really isn't very helpful, because the challenge comes after this, and it's applying that principle above and beyond the examples they learn. So they need to understand and be able to critically apply the learning that they have been given. Logic is a very similar thing, but logic goes beyond just logic in and of itself, but into things like cryptography and more. This is why Mentats are seen as not just advisors, but political advisors and spy masters in many cases. They need to be able to take what information they have, and often disparate and discrete data points, and find the connections that aren't available to them based on the information available, whether that's through inferring information or predicting what would happen based on the current circumstances. The language element is another major part of why we dismissed the eidetic memory idea earlier, but also because Mentats are clearly trained in language. This is not just language in terms of basic writing, reading, and comprehension skills. Instead, it crosses language as interpretation. So, as mentioned, the ability to take a few discrete data points and extrapolate out the whole of the image that's being presented based on not just what you know now, but what came beforehand, what information is missing, and where things would go going forwards. That is part of the critical thinking and pattern recognition and comprehension. They are requisites for a mentat, and this is why mentats become not only human computers, but political and strategic advisors. They need to know how to read people and events to then know when and how to act to get a result. For example, if the people here move, the other people over there will do this. A human chess, but arguably taking the idea of 4D chess and making it much more complicated, because they're not playing one game, they play multiple games simultaneously, and they nearly need to make every move at the same time. And these are skills that will be developed and improved upon through intensive education, the counseling and support of autistic children, and basically bringing them up in a dedicated facility, or more likely in this case something more akin to a cult, given how the order of Mentats is described. We now need to look at what Sappho juice might be doing, since it increases cognitive performance by 200 to 300%. The quick and easy answer to this is that Sappho juice is just liquid meth. Yes, it's not fancy or special, but it's also not very interesting. It also doesn't entirely fit with what we know. This will bring us to the alternatives. We know Sappho juice is plant-derived, so let's look at other plant-derived possibilities. Well, we have coffee or tea, but these are stimulants, not so much psychoactive performance enhancers. So what else could work? Well, we looked through a variety of options, and ultimately we found that no individual plant-based product would do this. But if we took a cocktail of different plant-based chemicals, things changed drastically. Now, our cocktail in question isn't necessarily ideal for a range of reasons, but theoretically, with it not being a perfect analogue for what's described in Sappho juice, it's at least a reasonable approximation. Our explanation, let's say, includes nicotine, caffeine, and ephedrine. All of these are derived from plants on Earth, but not all together. So it's basically if you took your coffee and made it a combination of ephedrine and nicotine. It would be quite the morning wake-up call, and then subsequent admission to emergency with cardiac rupture. But it would have a similar effect, given the effects that these three chemicals have on the human body. But the other effect is how and why it stains the lips of mentats a bright red, or as it is described, a ruby. This might actually be much easier to answer, and it's a very simple answer, if the plant origin is at least somewhat consistent with that of plants on Earth. Phenols, and specifically tannins. Tannins are a group of molecules that are prevalent in plants. They are very prevalent and can produce a reddish to green-blue-black color in leather. This would explain not just the color we see, but why it is consumed quickly, as tannins are very bitter and produce a red coloration. It is why red wine is red. It has a high tannin content. Now, why exactly it stains the human body, that one's a little more difficult. But for example, it may be similar in a way to, say, beetroot juice, which can stain the body. It's a purple color, but purple is close enough to red. So if it's having a similar ability to stain, there's your answer. How then do we break a mentat, or as it's described, a twisted mentat? This is arguably somewhat easier, as it removes some of the conditioning we described earlier in the video. The simple answer would be that the process of training a mentat without careful structure, environment, and care would lead to individuals who are rather warped and disturbed. For example, institutionalized children. This is also why most of the world with a strong social system has moved away from institutes like orphanages to instead residential care. Admittedly, children raised in cults don't turn out well anyway with a lot of support, so maybe it might be the other way around, or they become Twitch casters. It's easily one or the other. So let's bring all this together and how it might work in total. We'll use Zephyr Hawat, who is said to be the ultimate mentat that even the Padishah Emperor feared to some degree. Well, the limited demonstrated knowledge of genetics in the Dune universe means we'd be looking at traits and inheritance of those traits, or as it is properly called, phenotypes. That would mean that the order of mentats would be choosing children from a known pool or region with these traits, or observing children for the traits like we do today with diagnosing children with autism. They would be trying to pick them up at a very young age, ideally 2 years or less. Now, that's a very, very low threshold, but it would also explain why the rate of mentats is very low. Getting them at a young enough age to be able to do this would mean that anyone who's diagnosed at an older age wouldn't qualify. So the Fahawa would had to have been picked up very young. Then you would need to identify the traits needed for mentats to physically, anatomically, and physiologically be able to do their roles better. Now, in theory, medical checkups could provide some of these if you were to scan the individuals and see if their brain had the patterns that you were after. Now, not only are you looking for patterns like that, but you want to ensure that they're healthy. After all, a mentat will take many, many years, if not decades, to train up, so you don't want them dying partway through. Once you do have this individual and you've ensured they're reasonably healthy, in the Dune universe, given some of the environments and nature we've seen, there's a good chance you could either buy the child from the parents or effectively just seize them. From here, it's intensive and specialized training in the school or even a traineeship type program, where you have the first 10 years or so of life after they've been taken in, going through intensive learning about all of your core subjects, language, math, any of these STEM subjects, logic, philosophy, and so on, and then eventually going on to things like a strategy in the military, weapons, technology, psychology, and so on. And then at the end of this, you go on to a sort of traineeship, somewhere between a professional training program and a qualification where you would need to have higher level resources. It's a process focused on the individual needs initially, building on their strengths and addressing their weaknesses. This would continue for years and arguably up to decades. This would explain to an extent why we have someone like the Fahawat, who is said to be incredibly skilled. And not only would they need to have received the cream of the possible facilities, support, and so on, but they'd also have had to have the right mindset, both figuratively and literally going in, to ensure that they could absorb as much of this information, take it on board, and then utilize it. This would of course involve a fair amount of isolation from the wider world, while also developing the necessary knowledge, communication skills, and more. In a way, similar to what we see, to an extent today, with the younger autistic individuals being given counselling and similar to help resolve some of their social problems. At the same time, drugs are often used to help to an extent, particularly around emotional maintenance and ensuring a degree of stability. But last is drugs, and yes, sapphire juice could exist and it would work. It would work just like drugs in our reality, about with greater potency, combination of active ingredients, and effect. So overall, yes, mentats are entirely possible, or at least to some extent mentats are possible. But the way they select and train them isn't possible in the current world. But we also neither have AI overlords nor a jihad to destroy them, so there's no need for mentats. But if you were a evil dictatorship, and you were inclined to try this yourself, you theoretically could, and arguably North Korea has with their various hacking organizations who have been very prolific over recent years and very effective. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.